You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode, we're reviewing the Border-Gavaskar Trophy between Australia and India. And the Border-Gavaskar Trophy of 2024-25 was an enthralling series. We saw some record crowd numbers across the 5 test matches. We saw some outstanding performances with bat and ball and from certain individuals from both Australia and India throughout the series. We saw some controversial moments. Virat Kohli with Sam Constas at the MCG with the shoulder charge, the technology controversies that we saw at the MCG with Jaiswal in particular. It wouldn't be Australia and India without controversies on and off the field as well. Australia finally end India's Border-Gavaskar Trophy dominance, which lasted for a decade, over 10 years, and for the first time since 2014-15, won a test series against India at home in Australia. And Australia banished the Demons from the 2018-19 and 2020-21 series where they lost to India in the last 2 series here at home. They finally got the job done in this series, and it was a pretty good team effort to be 1 down, to win the series 3-1, I should say, after losing the first test in Perth. To win 3-1 is an incredible comeback, given the circumstances surrounding that test and what happened. On the other hand, India will be disappointed by the result. I think 3-1 is a true reflective of how they performed in the series in terms of how they performed across the first 5 test matches. They had some problems in this series. There was some dressing room unrest. There were pressure on key players like Rohit, Sharma and Virat Kohli in their form. The batting didn't stand up at times. The lack of bowling support for Bumrah. It was either Bumrah or bust with the bowling. And after the win in Perth, where they won by nearly 300 runs, pretty much India were on the foot after that, and Australia were able to come back and bounce back and win this series 3-1. So no doubt India will be disappointed by their results in this series. But it was a great series, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about how the series went for both teams. Where did it go right? Where did it go wrong? How did Australia win 3-1? How did India lose 3-1? And talk about and reminisce what has been probably one of the best Border-Gavaskar trophies that we've seen in recent times. And certainly the crowd numbers, the record crowd numbers certainly back that up over the 5 test matches. And a lot of people went out and watched these test matches, whether you be listening on the radio, watching on TV, or going to the ground yourself. It was an incredible series to watch. Enthralling cricket, we had some great moments, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about the series from start to finish and how both Australia and India were able to perform in this Border-Gavaskar Trophy, and how did Australia went on to bounce back from Perth to win the series 3-1, and where did it go wrong for India in terms of their series defeat for the first time to Australia in more than 10 years, and talk about some of the problems they had as a team throughout the series. So plenty to talk about and discuss. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's have a look back at the results from the 5 test matches in this Border-Gavaskar Trophy between Australia and India. The first test match was played in Perth at the Perth Stadium. India won by 295 runs. Jasprit Bumrah was named player of the match. The second test at the Adelaide Oval, the day-night test, Australia won that by 10 wickets. Travis Head was named player of the match. The third test at the Gabba was a draw because of the weather, and Travis Head was named player of the match. The fourth test at the MCG for Boxing Day, Australia won that by 184 runs. Pat Cummins was named player of the match. And the fifth and final test at the SCG, the New Year's test, Australia won by 6 wickets. Scott Boland was named player of the match. Australia won the series 3-1, and in the process reclaimed the Border-Gavaskar Trophy to end India's 10-year dominance, and Jasprit Bumrah was named the player of the series, and rightly so for his epic bowling performance. So that's pretty much how each of the 5 test matches went down in this Gavaskar Trophy in terms of the results. And in the end, Australia won the series 3-1. Let's talk about Australia and talk about their performance in the series, and talk about the batting bowling performances and how Australia were able to win this series 3-1. You would think after losing the first test match by 100 runs, everyone was saying Australia are done, they're finished, they're not going to win this series. Everyone was calling for the selectors to be sacked and sack everyone and, drop everyone and start afresh. This team is too old. They're dad's army. They don't have what it takes. Smith's out of form. Labuschagne's out of form. Khawaja's an old man. McSweeney being brought in as a new opener for this first test match. So there was a lot of scrutiny after the test match defeat in Perth for Australia. It was a crushing defeat, but it's probably the turning point in the series that they needed to turn things around. We saw that in the second test in Adelaide, where they won by 10 wickets. The third test match at the Gabba, they weren't able to get the job done because of the weather. Then in the fourth test in Melbourne on Boxing Day, a wonderful win. And then obviously to finish off the job in Sydney, to win the series 3-1. It's an incredible turnaround. And I suppose you can't really discount Australia from coming back from adversity. We've seen that from this Australian team led by Pat Cummins. We saw it in the 50-over World Cup 2 years ago in India, where they lost their first 2 games of the tournament, and they were able to get on a bit of a roll and qualify for the final and win the final against India. And that was a big achievement in itself. So this Australian team do have the ability to fight back when their backs are up against the wall. And certainly after that first test, a lot of people were saying, well, this is only going to go one way. It's probably going to be India to win this series. But that didn't turn out to be the case. Australia were able to bounce back and win the series 3-1. And after losing the 2 home series to India back in 2018-19, 2020-21, to finally get the job done in 2024-25 and reclaim the Border-Gavaskar Trophy for the first time in 10 years, it's been a great effort from Australia. Team effort. Everyone contributed with the bat and with the ball, and they were able to get the job done. And Pat Cummins led so well as captain in this series to really turn things around after the first test match in Perth. So in terms of Australia's batting performance, not a surprise that Travis Head was the leading run scorer for Australia, 440 runs with 2 centuries. And Pat Cummins was the leading wicket taker for Australia with 25 wickets across the test matches. Australia's batting, let's talk about that and how it went throughout the series. Going into the series, they had problems. Obviously, Smith and Labuschagne were out of form. Khawaja's getting on towards the end of his career. They brought in Nathan McSweeney to open for the first 3 test matches of the series before Sam Constas came in for the last 2 test matches. Mitchell Marsh was out of form. Bo Webster came in for him in the last test. Alex Carey had a pretty good series with the bat, and he was probably one of the in-form batters going into the series for Australia. Travis Head, the same, probably the best of the Australian batters going into the series. So Australia had a lot of question marks with their batting. They had a bit of a tough job facing Bumrah, the top order, because Bumrah was just superb in this series. But they found a way to score runs at crucial times and stand up. Travis Head, as I mentioned, what a series for Travis Head. And the last few years for Travis Head has been quite extraordinary in terms of contributing to wins for Australia. The World Test Championship final, the World Cup final a couple of years ago now. This series, no different, I should say. 448 runs, average of 56, high score of 152, which came at the third test in Brisbane. But he was instrumental at the start of the series, Travis Head. He started pretty well in the series. He scored an 80-odd in Perth. In the second innings, he scored 89 and really stood up in that second innings in Perth where Australia were blown away in that first test. And then to Adelaide, he scored his first 100 of the series, a very critical 100 in that test match to get Australia back on track in this series. And then obviously the next test in Brisbane after that, he scored the 100 in a game where Australia were looking like going to win, but the weather intervened. But he had a pretty good series, Travis Head. He looked probably the best of the Australian batters throughout the series. He dropped off towards the end of the series. He had some low scores in Melbourne and Sydney, but in the second innings in Sydney in the run chase, he was very pivotal. A brilliant partnership with Bo Webster, which got Australia over the line. That partnership was not out, unbeaten for the fifth wicket in that run chase. And he scored 34 not out, which pretty much got Australia over the line in that run chase. But early on in the series, it was pretty good. Dropped towards the back end of the series. But, he got the key wicket of Pant in Melbourne in the second innings. Then that started the Indian batting collapse, and Australia won that test match in Melbourne. So Travis Head had a pretty good series. Obviously, he had the run-in with Mohammad Siraj in Adelaide when they said a few words, when Siraj got him out after he scored that 100. But Travis Head, I think, looking back on the series, he'll be pretty happy with his output in terms of the batting side of things and with the ball, getting that key wicket of Rishabh Pant in Melbourne. So Travis Head, definitely the best of the Australian batters in the series. Then we move on to Steve Smith. Steve Smith under pressure going into the series. A lot of people saying, is he past it? Is he towards the end? Is he going to retire? Probably likely the last test in Sydney. That didn't turn out to be the case. In the end, scored 200s. He scored that brilliant 100 in Melbourne, which was a superb 100 going back to the old days of Steve Smith. The 100 in Brisbane, which was the first one he scored in the series, he looked a little bit all over the place, but he was able to turn that around in Melbourne and score that 100 in a very important test match for Australia to win this series. He got back into the runs, on track for 10,000 test runs. He fell short in Sydney. Obviously, he'll have to try and get that in Sri Lanka now, the 10,000 run. But for Steve Smith to get back into form the way he did with those 200s in Brisbane was so critical for Australia in terms of them winning the series. So it was good to see Smith back into the runs again there. And, he averaged 34 in the series, but he didn't look like someone averaging 34 in this series with the way he played in Melbourne with that 100, 140 he scored in that game for his high score of the series. He will be pretty pleased with the output that he put in this series. Obviously, a bit scratchy early on, but in the third, fourth, and even the fifth test as well, he looked pretty good with the bat, and he was able to contribute for Australia with the batting side of things there. Marnus Labuschagne struggled in the series. I don't think he'll be happy with the numbers that he produced in the series, but I think it's important to highlight, often it gets overlooked, and I think it's been overlooked really with Marnus, is that yes, Marnus struggled for form. The first test in Perth was horrible. He scored 2 in the first innings, and he scored 3 in the second innings in that first test in Perth. He was all over the place. People were saying he should be dropped, should be rested, have a bit of a rest, a break, get away from it all. But I think we've got to remember that Marnus played some important innings in this series. In Adelaide, for example, the partnership with McSweeney, late on day one, under lights with the pink ball, India was searching for wickets. They took the wicket of Khawaja just before the day one, and Marnus and McSweeney needed to build a partnership, which they did. The partnership they put on together in the first innings was a pretty good partnership. It was 67 for the second wicket, and that set up Australia in that test match in Adelaide, and then it allowed Travis Head to score that 100, 140, and were able to power to a very good score of 337 after bowling India out in the first 180. And it was so important, that innings there, that partnership, that innings for Marnus to get back into form was for him. He scored some good runs in that Adelaide test in terms of, being able to turn the fortunes around after what was a disappointing result in Perth. He was able to do that in Adelaide. He scored 64 in that first innings, and obviously didn't bat in the second innings because they won by 10 wickets, chasing a small target in the end of 19 runs. But that partnership in Melbourne was so important. The partnership in Adelaide, and that goes on to the next thing I'm going to say, is that the partnership that he had with Pat Cummins in the second innings in Melbourne was so critical. He scored back-to-back 70s in that test match in Melbourne on a very, difficult situations to be in. Australia had a bit of a batting collapse in Melbourne, especially in the second innings. Jasper Bumrah took 3 wickets for 4 runs in that spell. Australia lost 4 wickets in 21 balls or something. The lead for Australia was only 196 runs. So Australia were looking like probably losing that test match in India, probably forging one of the great comebacks ever in the history of test cricket. But Marnus stood up. He scored 70s in both innings. He scored 72 in the first innings, 70 in the second innings. But the partnership he had with Pat Cummins of 57 for the 7th wicket was such an important innings that really set up that test match for Australia, because Australia were able to get out of that difficult situation with Bumrah and the batting collapse. And then obviously Pat Cummins, Marnus's partnership of 57, plus the tail ender runs from Lyon and Boland of 61 for the 10th wicket. Australia were able to get a lead of 339, set India 340 to win that test in Melbourne, and were able to get the job done in the end, as we know. So I think it's overlooked. Yes, that Marnus failed in Perth. He failed in Perth. He failed in Brisbane, failed in Sydney with low scores. But let's not forget that he played, a few innings which were instrumental in Australia winning this series. The Adelaide Test and the Melbourne Test, as I mentioned. So Marnus will be disappointed about numbers. Obviously, he'll be hoping for better results going forward for Australia for the rest of the year in 2025 in terms of the Test series to Sri Lanka and the West Indies, and obviously World Test Championship, then the Ashes later on this year for the next Australian summer. But I think for Marnus, and I think for everyone, we need to remember he was instrumental in the series. Even though he wasn't at his best, he was instrumental in the Test in Adelaide and in Melbourne because of those important innings and partnerships that he had. Without those innings and partnerships that Marnus did, Australia probably wouldn't have won this series. It would have been a different result. So we've got to remember that despite the failures that Marnus had in this series, he scored some important runs when needed, and he had important partnerships when required for Australia, when they were struggling, especially against Bumrah in that test in Melbourne. So for Marnus, a bit of a mixed series, but he was important in those 2 test matches where Australia won in Adelaide and in Melbourne. Usman Khawaja, getting towards the end of his career, he had a bit of an up and down series. Probably not the series that he would have liked, but he struggled at the top of the order, as all the Australian batters did, especially to Bumrah. I think Khawaja said at the end of the series, he said, I was Bumrah. Just couldn't get a hold of Jasper Bumrah. It was very tough work with the new balls facing Bumrah, the way that he was bowling in this series. But Khawaja played some, crucial knocks, and he was involved in some partnerships that were instrumental, just like with Marnus Labuschagne. Khawaja's opening partnership with Constas in the first innings in Melbourne was crucial. Australia were able to get a score of 474 on the first innings. Sam Constas doing what he was doing, that sort of rubbed off on Usman Khawaja, and he scored his first 50 of the series. And then the last test match in Sydney in the second innings, the opening partnership again with Constas, but also scoring 40-odd runs in that run chase where Australia were chasing only 160-odd to win was so crucial as well. So just like with Marnus Labuschagne, Khawaja, he did have his role to play in the series, even though he did have some failures along the way. But in Melbourne and Sydney, he was instrumental in terms of scoring the runs and the partnerships that he had with Constas, and what he did in Sydney in the run chase was critical as well. So Khawaja had a bit of an up and down series, but just like Marnus Labuschagne, he did play his role at times in the series. Sam Constas, let's talk about him quickly. Lot to learn for Sam, but an exciting player nonetheless. What an innings he played in Melbourne. On debut, Boxing Day test, 19 years old, on test debut. Some 19-year-olds will be overwhelmed by that situation, but not Sam Constas. He came out and he lapped Bumrah for 4 and 6. He ramped him. India were ragged. He had the incident with Kohli where Kohli shoulder charged him. That didn't seem to unfaze him. He played his natural game, selected to do a job, and that was to put India off their game, and that's what he certainly did in Melbourne in the first innings when he scored the 60. It was quite entertaining. And And then obviously in Sydney, in the last game of the series, in the second innings in the run chase, his innings was crucial. Even though he didn't score many runs, he only scored 20-odd runs. But that opening partnership with Khawaja, where Australia were chasing 160-odd to win, it was so important to get off to a good start. And that's what Constas did. He was able to put pressure on Siraj and Krishna in that second innings where Bumrah wasn't bowling because of the injury that he sustained. They were able to, get off to a good start in the run chase. So Sam, a lot of people are criticizing him in terms of his naivety, the immature sort of nature that he possesses. But I think everyone tends to forget that he's only 19 years old. I'm pretty sure everyone who's listening to this episode of the podcast today, I'm pretty sure when you were 19, you were a bit immature. You wanted to have a good time. You didn't care about anything. You didn't worry about anything. You just went out there and just did it. And that's what Sam did in these first 2 test matches. Now, obviously, the more experience that Sam will get, the more older he will get. He will learn the lessons, and he will learn some valuable lessons in this couple of test matches that he played in this series, especially the last test where he had words with Bumrah and the Indian team swarmed him, and that wasn't his battle to pick. It was more of Khawaja and Bumrah sort of battle. But with age comes wisdom and maturity. And with Sam, he's only 19. He'll learn about his game. He'll learn how to go about things in Test cricket. There's another side of his game. He's quite responsible. He can play in a different way than what we saw in the series. But for this series, he was given the backing of Pat and obviously Andrew McDonald, which was to go out there, play a natural game. We want you to be aggressive to Bumrah and try and get the team off to a good start. And that's what he did in Melbourne. And that's what he did in the second innings in Sydney in the run chase. So with Sam, there's a lot to learn, but he's got a future in Test cricket. It's all about the learning process for him now in the journey. And I'm sure people who are his mentors and even teammates will talk to him about certain things. But we've got to remember he's only 19, but he did make an impact in the series, especially in that Test match in Melbourne. And it went a long way for Australia to win the series, but also that Test match in Melbourne. Nathan McSweeney got dropped after 3 Test matches. You got a feel for him, averaging just 14 in the series with the highest score of 39 in Adelaide in the second Test. You got a feel for Nathan, but he will be back. It was very tough for him at the top of the order facing Bumrah, as it was for everyone in the Australian batting lineup. He wasn't the only one. So for McSweeney, it was a bit unlucky for him to get dropped, but he will be back in the Australian Test setup. He's just been in the squad for the Sri Lanka series. So obviously McSweeney being dropped for the last couple of Test matches of this series against India, but he's back in the Test series. He's back in the Test squad again for Sri Lanka, which is Australia's next assignment. So that's good for Nathan, and obviously he'll get his opportunity again. Mitchell Marsh struggled with bat and ball in the series. He was replaced by Beau Webster towards the end of the series, who did well on Test debut, scored a 50, a couple of catches and a wicket, hit the winning runs. So brilliant Test debut for Beau Webster. Obviously in place of Mitchell Marsh, who did struggle with bat and ball, didn't bowl many overs in the series. He didn't score many runs. He's been out of form, and that's why Australia went with Beau Webster for the last Test in Sydney, who did pretty well, as I mentioned. Alex Carey did well in the series. He scored that 70 in Brisbane. He'll be disappointed not to, get a bigger score than that, because he looked pretty good going into the series. He was one of the informed batters for Australia. I thought his wicket-keeping in the series was immaculate. Took every chance that went his way. Kept pretty well. He was pretty tidy. Just going under the radar, Alex Carey, and just doing his job, which is superb. And also the tail ender runs. Let's talk about that quickly before we move on. The tail ender runs from Cummins line, Boland at the MCG was so crucial. But throughout the whole entire series, the tail ender runs for Australia was so crucial. And that was the difference in terms of getting Australia out of a bit of a jam, especially in Melbourne, where Bumrah was going off with that epic spell of bowling on day 4. So Australia's batting still has a lot of question marks, But going into the series, they were able to find a way at times to get through Bumrah and were able to score runs when needed for Australia. So I think a lot of them will be pleased about how they played in the series. Probably Travis Head, Steve Smith, Carey, Webster in that one game in the last test. Other people will be disappointed, like Labuschagne and Khawaja. Sam Constance will just be happy that he played 2 test matches and made an impact. Mitchell Marsh and McSweeney will be disappointed with their results in this series. So Australia's batting wasn't at its best, but it was able to stand up when needed and to score crucial runs when needed from certain individuals. So that's the batting for Australia in this series and how they went about things. The bowling side of things, what can you say? Pat Cummins, Scott Boland, Mitchell Starc. Nathan Lyon didn't do much in the series. He only picked up 9 wickets, but he didn't bowl much in the series. Josh Hazlewood, in the 2 games that he played, made an impact. The Australian bowlers bowled really well in this series. They didn't give anything to the Indian batters. And we saw throughout this series they were able to dismiss India for 6 scores between 150 and 190, barring the first test in Perth, where they conceded 487 runs declared in that first innings. But Australia were able to bowl India out for scores of 180, 175 in Adelaide, obviously 155 in the second innings in Melbourne, 185 and 157 in the last test in Sydney. So it just shows that the Australian bowlers used the conditions well. The pitches throughout this whole entire series had a bit of something in them, and the Australian bowlers were threatening and dangerous. Cummins, 25 wickets. Scott Boland was superb, 21 wickets. Mitchell Starc bowled probably the best he's ever bowled in his career, 18 wickets in the series. As I mentioned, Nathan Lyon didn't even do much. He had the feet up. He didn't bowl much in the test in Melbourne or in Sydney, but he did take 9 wickets and did his role. Josh Hazlewood was good in the 2 test matches he played, but unfortunately got that side strain after the first test in Perth, and he missed out in Adelaide. And then obviously in Brisbane he played, but he picked up a calf. And then obviously Scott Boland came in and did what he did. Pat Cummins, let's talk about Pat. Pat was outstanding in terms of not only taking wickets, but his run scoring as well. He scored some vital runs in the 4th test in Melbourne. He took wickets. He took the key wickets at crucial times. He brought himself on when Australia needed a breakthrough. He got the key wickets in this series. For example, the Jaiswal wicket at the MCG, the second innings, controversial. Did Jaiswal get a touch on it or not? Pat Cummins came in, bowled the short ball down the leg side. Jaiswal took the bait. That was a key wicket in terms of Australia winning that test match in Melbourne. The last test match in Sydney, he got the key wicket of Rishabh Pant in the second innings. Pant was going off. India were looking like getting the score of probably setting a target of 200 plus for Australia to chase down. Cummins came on, got the key wicket of Pant late on day 2, and that pretty much changed the game around on its head. As I mentioned, scored runs at times in the series as well. So it was a great series from Pat Cummins. Mitchell Starc was good as well. I think he bowled probably the best he's bowled in his entire career. His accuracy at times was superb. He got the key wickets. He got rid of Jaiswal. First ball at the Adelaide Oval, LBW, where Australia needed to bounce back. They needed to start well in that second test match after the drubbing they got in Perth. And for Mitchell Starc to do that first ball of the innings to get rid of Jaiswal really set the tone for Australia in the test match. And that's why they went on to win by 10 wickets. He got the key wicket of Virat Kohli in the second innings in Melbourne. Just before the lunch break, he got him out nicking off. How often have we seen Kohli in this series nicking off? And that was the start of the batting collapse for India in that test match. Obviously dropped off towards the end of the series. The last test in Sydney, he took 3 wickets in the first innings, but in the second innings, he got a bit of tap from Jaiswal. The back injury that he picked up in Melbourne was starting to show. But putting that to one side, he had a pretty good series, Mitchell Starc. 18 wickets, best of 6 for 48, which was in Adelaide in that day-night test. Is a pretty good series from Mitchell Starc, and it's probably the best he's ever bowled, really. So brilliant there from Starc. Scott Boland. Let's talk about Scotty Boland. What a series for Scott Boland. 21 wickets, 6 for 45, which was in the last test in Sydney. What a series for Scott Boland. He played 3 test matches. All of those test matches were a part of Australia's wins. So in Adelaide, Melbourne, and Sydney, he played in those 3 wins. He didn't play in the first 2 because of Josh Hazlewood, but he came back in for Josh Hazlewood and was out injured. Outstanding performance with him with the ball. He bowled well. In this series, he came on and got key wickets at crucial times. He picked up 2 wickets in an over. He picked up a wicket first ball of an over that he bowled in the series. He got rid of Virat Kohli so many times in the series. Got him out in Adelaide. Got him out in Sydney in the last test as well. He should have got him out 3 times if that catch of Steve Smith was ruled a fair catch. So technically, in the last test, he got rid of Virat Kohli out twice. But when Kohli came out to the crease, he nicked off for a golden duck. But unfortunately, the catch that Steve Smith took wasn't ruled a fair catch, as we know. But technically, you could say that Scott Boland got him out 3 times in that test match. It just shows you how well he bowled in this series, especially the last test in Sydney. The pitch was made for him. The green grass, the uneven bounce, the seam movement, the swing. It was made for Scott Boland. Just hits the spot, accurate bowling type bowling. That's what you're going to get from Scott Boland. And what a bowler. Just born in a different time. If he was born much earlier, he would have had a lot of opportunities for Australia. But when you were in a bowling attack that contains Cummins, Stark, Lyon, Hazlewood, it's always going to be difficult to get an opportunity. But we've seen from Scott Boland in his career, when he has an opportunity, he's made the most of it. We saw that when he debuted at the MCG, where he took the 6 for 7 in 2021 against England. He took that opportunity. This series, he took the opportunity. The test match in Sydney, he took the opportunity. Just shows how good of a bowler he is. And he had a pretty good series, Scott Boland. Nathan Lyon didn't do much in the series. Pretty much the spinners on both sides. Nathan Lyon, and obviously for Australia, and then obviously for India. You had Jadeja and didn't really do much in the series because spin wasn't a big part in the series. It was more of the pace department because of the pitches and what they offered. Didn't really offer much spin throughout the series, but Nathan Lyon got 9 wickets. He got the important wicket in the Melbourne test, which was Mohammad Siraj to wrap up that test match on the last day. He got a key wicket of Shubman Gill in the last test in Sydney just before lunch in the first innings. So he played his part, Nathan Lyon. But a pretty quiet series by his stats. Didn't really do much bowling. Josh Hazlewood was injured for the whole series. He only played 2 test matches. Were in Perth and Brisbane. Got injured. He took 6 wickets. He looked pretty good in those 2 tests that he played. As always, Josh Hazlewood. Mitchell Marsh didn't do much with the ball. We've already discussed that with his output in the series. Travis Head picked up a couple of wickets. Obviously, the big wicket of Rishabh Pant in Melbourne was a big wicket to help Australia win that test match and cause that batting collapse. Bo Webster picked up a wicket on debut in the last test in Sydney. So the Australian bowling attack bowled pretty well throughout this series. They all contributed. They all took wickets. They all needed to do what they needed to do at times in the series. And it was a pretty good bowling performance. And I think for Australia as a whole, looking at this series, I think they'll be pleased about they were able to, score runs and take wickets when needed. They stood up. They were able to keep their nerve in Perth. It would have been easy just to surrender after the first test in Perth and say, oh, you know what, we're probably not going to win the series. We're not playing as well as we should. But they were able to turn it around. And it's an incredible comeback to win one after the drubbing they got in Perth. It's an incredible comeback. And obviously for this Australian team to win every single bilateral trophy that's available in Test cricket, plus the World Test Championship and the 50-over World Cup. It just shows you how good Australia have been over the last few years with Pat Cummins and his leadership. Since Pat Cummins has come to the helm, Australia have won just about everything, really. And also, winning this series means a lot after 10 years of not winning the Border-Gavaskar Trophy. this Australian team, there's only been 4 players that have won a test series against India. That was Steve Smith, 1, Mitchell Marsh, 2, Nathan Lyon, 3, and Josh Hazlewood, 4. Those players were a part of the 2014-15 series, which Australia won that test series in Australia to win the Border-Gavaskar Trophy. And to lose the last 2 series in Australia, 2018-19, 2020-21, they were able to get the job done this time around. They learned the lessons from the past. They learned, from those 2 series, and they were able to win the series. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, India weren't good enough to take the opportunities that were presented to them, but Australia were, and that's why they were able to win the series 3-1. So a fantastic performance by Australia. They'll be very delighted to win the series, and all the hard work and all the dedication throughout the series has paid off in terms of trying to play their best cricket to try and beat this Indian side, and they certainly got the job done. So that's Australia in terms of their performance throughout the series with their batting and bowling and how they went about to win this series 3-1. Let's talk about India and talk about their series and how they went about things with the batting and bowling side of things in this series. Why did they lose this series 3-1? Let's talk about that. A 3-1 series result for India is probably a good sort of result, really, to reflect their performance in this Border-Gavaskar Trophy. Their batting struggled at times. Bumrah was the only one that really kept them in the series, really, with his magnificent bowling performances, as we'll talk about shortly. He had no support from the other bowlers. Siraj and others did their best at times, but it wasn't enough. They were outplayed after the first test in Perth, where they won that first test match by nearly 300 runs. Everyone thought, India probably going to win this series, but they didn't play well after that. They played poorly in Adelaide, Brisbane, Melbourne, especially Melbourne. That was a test match that they should have drawn, but it wasn't to be the case because they had that batting collapse on the last day in the last session. That was pretty much caused by Rishabh Pant, and it was all his fault. And then the last test in Sydney on a very difficult surface, on a lively surface, they struggled against Australia's bowlers, especially Scott Boland in particular. Also, you had some dressing room upheaval and unrest. There was some reports about, some arguments and anger in the dressing room. Rohit Sharma was under pressure to resign and to give up the captaincy. Ravi Ashwin retired after the Brisbane test, which was a bit of a shock for everyone. So they had a bit of dressing room unrest, plus the retirement of Ashwin. So it wasn't a great series for India on and off the field, and that reflected in their performance. And going into this series, they would have joined the likes of England, West Indies, and South Africa to win 3 consecutive test series in Australia. Unfortunately, series didn't quite go to plan, and that run and that domination that they had for 10 years over Australia in the Border-Gavaskar Trophy has finally ended after a long decade. So let's talk about how they went about things. We'll start with the batting side of things. Jaiswal, the leading run scorer for the series for India, 391 runs, and he scored that magnificent 100 in Perth, 161 he scored in that first test. He was the leading run scorer for India with the bat series. India's batting struggled throughout the series. There were 6 scores between 150 and 190 that they got out and were bowled out in this series. The first test in Perth in the first innings, they were bowled out for 150 and then made 6 declared for 487 in the second innings. The second test in Adelaide, they were bowled out for 180 and 175. The third test in Brisbane, they made 260 in the first innings and none for 8 in the second innings there. The fourth test in Melbourne, 369 and 155. And the fifth and final test of the series, they were bowled out for 185 and 157. So it just shows you that India weren't able to put up those big scores when needed, and they did struggle. The pitches had a bit of something in them. They found it tough. The top order didn't score runs consistently. Didn't really quite do their job at times, really, and that was the disappointing factor about their batting. Jaiswal, Kumar Reddy, KL Rahul, probably the three best Indian batters in this series, you'll have to say. Both of them, really scored bulk of the runs for India in the series. And they were pretty good in the series. Jaiswal scored that 100 in Perth. He then went on to score 80s in the fourth test in Melbourne. He had a bit of a quiet period in the second and third test matches, obviously to Mitchell Starc, who got him out in both test matches there. The first ball in Adelaide, LBW, got him out in Brisbane as well, Mitchell Starc, Jaiswal. The last test in Sydney, he struggled as well. Kumar Reddy was superb. The 100 he scored in Melbourne with his father in the crowd in tears was a brilliant moment. At one stage, he could have been stranded on 99 not out, but he finally got the 100. KL Rahul was pretty good in the series, good opening the batting, looked pretty good technically. He's been in and out of the Indian side for some time, but probably going forward into the future, you would think KL Rahul and Jaiswal will be the opening partnership going forward for India, given Rohit Sharma's towards the end of his career and the writing is on the wall. He batted well, but then dropped off towards the back end of the series. He had pretty quiet test matches in Melbourne and Sydney, but those three were pretty much India's best batters. And then you go to Rohit Sharma, Virat Kohli, Rishabh Pant, and Shubman Gill were disappointing at times in the series. Rohit Sharma, for starters, out of form, batted in the middle order when he came back in the second test in Adelaide. That didn't work in the Adelaide test and the Brisbane test, so he decided to go back up to the top of the order. In Melbourne, that didn't work. And then obviously in the last test match, he dropped himself. But from his words, he said he was resting, opting to rest. We're not that stupid in the cricket world. We all know that he was dropped. And just say that, just say I was dropped. I dropped myself because I wasn't good enough. I'm not in good form. I'm at the crossroads in my career. We just want that transparency. And I think that's what Indian fans would have wanted, transparency, and just say, yeah, I dropped myself. I didn't, resting is probably not the right word to use. Probably, yeah, I dropped myself. I omitted myself from the 11 because I wasn't in the best form. He scored 31 runs and an average of 6, highest score of 10, Rohit Sharma. So it just shows you how much he struggled. Also pressure from everyone, fans and within the camp about the dressing room unrest, his captaincy future, his playing future. So he was under pressure, Rohit Sharma. Virat Kohli, after the 100 he scored in Perth, pretty much dropped off, really. Kept nicking off outside the off stump against Scott Boland in particular. Got him out twice in the last test in Sydney. Well, technically 3 times if that catch off Smith was allowed, but it wasn't. He had his problems. Obviously, what happened with Sam Constas and him at the MCG, the SCG in the last test, he was, having a few interactions with the crowd. So Virat Kohli's not the player that he once was. He struggled and he failed to, get some runs after that 100 in Perth. Rishabh Pant, scored, some runs in the series. He showed his best at times in the series. The second innings in Sydney, he was able to score 61 and was able to, get some runs there and do pretty well in terms of trying to get India to a good position in the second innings in the last test in Sydney. But obviously he got some criticism and some backlash after what happened in Melbourne in both innings when he was dismissed pretty ordinary, playing some pretty bad shots, especially the second innings where he took on Travis Head and he held out to the deep where Mitchell Marsh took the catch and wide long on. And that pretty much sparked the batting collapse for India in the last session on day 5, where Australia were able to pick up 7 wickets in 20-odd overs to win the test match. And that's where India should have played the match situation. That's where Rishabh Pant should have played the match situation, but he didn't. He couldn't resist because it's Rishabh Pant and he's that type of player. So he didn't have the best series that he would have liked either, but he showed glimpses of what he can do in all of the 5 test matches, but it wasn't a consistent performance from him nonetheless. And then you had Shubman Gill. He was disappointing. He only played 3 test matches in the series. He was dropped for the test in obviously Melbourne. He didn't play the first test because of injury. He wasn't at his best in the series. He got starts and then got out. He made some good 20s and 30s and then got out. Shubman Gill sort of reminds me of a James Vince, someone who looks pretty good on the eye, plays some good shots, and then gets out. Makes 20s and 30s and gets out. And that's what Shubman Gill's doing at the moment. And he hasn't really lived up to the potential of his, talents. And then obviously in the last test in Sydney, that was a horrible dismissal first innings where he got out just before lunch to Nathan Lyon after he had a few words with Steve Smith and then he got out. That wasn't a great dismissal, running down the track and edging one to first slip. And then in the second innings, it was a massive hoik across the line, got an inside edge, and Bo Webster got his first test wicket, and it was a pretty good catch from Alex Carey behind the stumps. So Gill wasn't at his best in this series either. So that pretty much tells the story about India's batting in this series. They just weren't able to be consistent, and they weren't able to get through Australia's bowling. And these pitches across the series had a bit of something in them, barring the first test in Perth where it flattened out and it was a batting paradise. But in the test matches in Adelaide, Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney, especially Sydney in the last test because it was quite lively, India's batters didn't really handle that all that well. And, players out of form, Curly and Rohit Sharma in particular. But I suppose there were some positives with Jaiswal and Kumar Reddy and KL Rahul. But besides from that, there weren't too many positives with the batting side of things. They just really struggled. They weren't able to score the runs. They were bowled out for 6 scores between 50 and 190. It just shows you how tough it was for batting, not only for India in the series, but for the whole entire series. Australia found it tough facing Bumrah, and their top order crumbled as well at times. So India's really struggled in the series, and probably they'll be disappointed with their performance in the series. We move on from the batting side of things for India and talk about the bowlers and talk about their performance in the series. There was only one person that really stood up for India with the ball, and that was Jasprit Bumrah. He was the only one that really, gave India a chance of winning this series. 32 wickets, 3 5-wicket hauls, the best of 6 for 76 in his bowling performance in this series. 32 wickets in the series. Now, to put it into some context, so the rest of India's bowlers, if you combine Mohammad Siraj, Krishna, Kumar Reddy, Akashdeep, Rana, Jadeja, Sundar and Ashwin, if you combine all of their wickets together, they took 48 wickets and Bumrah took 32. So it just shows you that, Bumrah was pivotal in terms of this series. And another clear indication is that Bumrah took 32 wickets, Siraj took 20. So he was 12 wickets better than Siraj in the series. It just shows you how well he bowled. He produced some outstanding performances in the series with the ball. The first test match in Perth, that spell late on day one was pretty good in terms of that performance. And then what he did in Melbourne, trying to get India back into the game, where he took those 3 wickets for 4 runs. Australia had a batting collapse of 4 for not in 21 balls. The lead was only 196. He tried his best to get India back into the test match, but unfortunately it wasn't quite good enough to do that. And then obviously in the last test in Sydney, he got injured. It just highlighted how important he was in the series. And we saw that in the last test match in Sydney, where Siraj and Krishna had to pick up the workload in the second innings, and both of them, really struggled to take the wickets in the second innings because of the absence of Bumrah. It just shows how important he was for India in the series. To be the player of the series in a losing team, it's probably reminding us all of Shane Warne in 2005. He took wickets in that series and Australia didn't win. It's just the same here with Bumrah. On the losing side, player of the series took 32 wickets. It just shows you how big of an impact he had in the series. India badly missed the support for Bumrah in terms of Mohammad Shami. They needed Shami in this series, and they weren't able to get him fit enough to play in the series. As I mentioned before, Siraj was up and down in the series. He had his moments, but he wasn't consistent. Krishna did okay in the last test that he played in the series. Kumar Reddy's not really a bowler. He's more of a batter at this stage of his career. Akashdeep bowled well at times, but his figures don't quite reflect that. Harshit Rana, he bowled well in the first test in Perth, but in the second test in Adelaide, Travis Head just lined him up, and that was pretty much the end of his series. Jadeja and Sundar and Ashwin, in terms of the spin department, didn't really have much of a role to play, but they all tried their best. But really, it was Bumrah or bust for India with the bowling. And they can't do that for a long, sustainable period, India. They've got to have some other support with Bumrah. They've got to have some bench strength. They've got to get some bowling stocks in their team going forward, because he can't do it all the time. He needs support. He needs that support, and he didn't have that in this series. So that's why you just marvel at the bowling performance. Bumrah, outstanding. Unplayable at times. And the Australian order said the same thing. The rest of the Australian batters said, yeah, it was very tough work facing Bumrah. He was always at you. He was always on the money, and it was difficult to face him. So, yeah, very difficult for India. But if India, looking back on this series, it was a series full of opportunities. They had their moments. They showed their capability, their batting and bowling at times. We saw some fight backs and some comebacks. We saw that in the third test in Brisbane, where they avoided the follow-on. We saw that in Melbourne in the first innings, but also where Bumrah bowled and tried to get India back into the test match. We even saw that in the fifth test in Sydney to an extent. But it wasn't good enough to win and to beat Australia. And India have a lot of questions going forward in terms of how do they rebuild their test side, especially Rohit Sharma and Virat Kohli being under the microscope. But putting that to one side, a 3-1 series defeat is probably a good reflection on how India performed in the series. At the end of the day, there was only one person with the ball, that was Bumrah. The batting didn't stand up, the top order failed, and they weren't able to capitalize on their moments. And if they look back in the series, I think they'll say the same thing. I think they'll say, yeah, we had the opportunities, we had our moments, but we weren't able to capitalize. And that's why India lost the series 3-1. Some concluding thoughts, final thoughts, and some of my observations from this series to end our review of the Border-Gavaskar Trophy between Australia and India. It was a great series, and what a series we had. 5 test matches that had something about them. The cricket was enthralling. Australia were able to bounce back after the disappointment of Perth. A lot of people were calling for a lot of people to be sacked, dropped, the selectors to tear it all up and start again. But they were able to bounce back well in Adelaide, where they won by 10 wickets. They played well in Brisbane, even though that was a draw because of the weather. They played well in Melbourne, probably, arguably probably the best test of the entire series. The drama going down to the last day, last session, last hour on day 5. And for Australia to win that and to lead 2-1 up going into Sydney, and then to get the job done in Sydney on that lively surface, which is unusual for the SCG. To win the series 3-1 is a true reflection of how well Australia have bounced back since that first test match in Perth. And that was probably the turning point of the series for Australia, just to really make them aware that we need to play better than this, we need to perform better, and they were able to do that. On the other hand, with India, Jasper Bumrah was outstanding. Probably sort of reminiscent of Shane Warne back in 2005, where he took 40 wickets in that series, and Australia didn't win the series. It sort of feels like the same with Bumrah. He took 32 wickets, player of the series, but India didn't win the series. They lost 3-1. You got a feel for Bumrah. He bowled his heart out. The last Test match, it was a shame that he got out with the injury there, and he couldn't bowl in the second innings, and it really showed where India relying on Krishna and Siraj to get the job done, try and get those 10 wickets at the end of that last Test match. They weren't able to do that because of Bumrah's absence, and you can see how important Bumrah was in the series, especially in the first 4 Test matches of this series. And then in the 5th Test, the first innings he had a bit of an impact, but the second innings he couldn't bowl because of that injury to his back. Let's hope it's not too serious. But what a performance by him. Probably the best bowling performance I've seen individually for some time. And I think everyone would agree with that. The top order from Australia struggled throughout the whole entire series. You hear a lot of them say it was tough work, and it was, especially on the lively pitches that we had throughout the 5 Test matches. India would be bitterly disappointed. Their batting faltered. The bowling support wasn't there for Bumrah. Kohli and Rohit Sharma were out of form. I suppose they can take some positives with Jaiswal and Kumar Reddy and KL Rahul, who really batted well in the series. But the other batters, Rohit Sharma, Kohli, not performing at their best. Rishabh Pant showed glimpses of his best but wasn't consistent. Shubman Gill was disappointing. A very disappointing series for India, and a lot of questions going forward for them in terms of how do they rebuild going forward as a Test team. And obviously they had the dressing room unrest. There was a lot of murmurings in the dressing room. There was a lot of people not happy with certain things, players not happy. Ravi Ashwin retired after the Brisbane Test, which was a bit of a shock to everyone, sort of doing like what MS Dhoni did back in 2014-15 when he retired at the end of that MCG Test, which was a bit of a shock. It was out of the blue. Same here with Ashwin. So there was a lot of problems that he had on and off the field, and trying to win this series was very difficult for them. But they did well in the first Test in Perth. But after that dominant win, they were pretty much on the back foot after that first Test. And I think many people would agree with that Australia did play the better cricket from the second Test onwards to the last Test of this series. And they will be disappointed, India, but I suppose it sort of marks sort of the end and a golden era of Indian cricket. And now they have to move forward and move on. And I think going into the series, both teams had those question marks about, transition and their batting not being good. Their bowling attacks were pretty good. They had a lot of questions, both Australia and India. But, this series lived up to expectations, as it always does between Australia and India. And Australia thoroughly deserved to win the series 3-1. And for Pat Cummins and for Australia, to achieve what they've achieved in this series is remarkable. But also to, win every bilateral trophy that's available in Test cricket. That has never been done before, plus the World Test Championship and plus the 50-over World Cup. The only one that's missing from the list is the T20 World Cup, which Australia failed to win last year in the West Indies and the USA. But when you look at that, that's a great achievement. And since Pat Cummins has been captain, he's really led the team well, even though he has his critics and people don't like the way he goes about things. But at the end of the day, you got to say he's a pretty good player. He scored runs, he took wickets, he captained well in this series. You compare that with India. They were a different team when Jasper Bumrah was captain in the first and in the last Test match of the series, compared to Rohit Sharma when he was captain for the second, third, and fourth Test. There was a contrast there. But yeah, what a series. It's a shame that it's over. I think a lot of people are saying, we want more cricket. We wish that this was a 6-game series or a 7-game series, would have been enthralling cricket. But I suppose, this will whet the appetite for the next series between Australia and India, which will be in India, 5 games for that series in the subcontinent. So we've only got a few more years to wait until that next battle between Australia and India. But to finish off, great series. I think both teams played some good cricket at times. Australia were good enough to win the series 3-1. Unfortunately for India, they had opportunities. And, they look back and say, we had opportunities, but we didn't make the most of them at crucial times in the series. And Jasprit Bumrah, outstanding performance from him to single-handedly, get India back into the test matches at times. What he did in Perth, what he did in Melbourne in that spell. India nearly had a chance of pulling that out of the bag. And then obviously the last test, he got injured and that was the end of that. But you got to admit, it was an outstanding performance by him. And what a performance with the ball throughout this whole entire series. And what a series it was as well. And congratulations to Australia winning 3-1. Thanks, everyone, for listening to our Border-Gavaskar Trophy review between Australia and India. If you're watching or listening to this episode of the podcast on our YouTube channel, let us know your thoughts on this Border-Gavaskar Trophy between Australia and India in the comments. We would love to hear what you have to say. Thanks for watching and listening. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.